Now, religion also has another connection with awe. As the psychologist Dr. Kupner points out, our religious and spiritual teachings and practices themselves arose from some person's awe experience. Our beliefs and rituals are themselves archives of ancient experiences of awe. Now, Yates and Newberg identified that these religious experiences generally contain a feeling of unity with God, nature, the universe, or other people, and some sense of transcending or losing the self or the ego. Now, mystical experiences are the most extreme version of what are a variety of self-transcendent experiences. Psychologists also list mindfulness, flow, other types of awe, peak experiences as other common human moments of self-transcendence that fall short of the most vivid mystical experiences. In his classical study of mysticism, the father of American psychology, William James, described them as having these four qualities, which I memorized as a sophomore in college. I got a William James class. Ineffable, that we can't adequately describe our experiences to other people. A noetic quality, meaning that we gain some sort of knowledge or some sort of revelation, much like what happens to Isaiah in his vision. Third, that these experiences are transient, they don't last for long. And finally, that we are passive in these moments, that they come upon us from some outside force. More recent empirical studies have revealed similar but different qualities. A 2015 study of mystical experiences, for instance, found that they include a feeling of unity with ultimate reality, being overwhelmed with positive emotions in the form of ecstasy, losing our sense of space and time, and finally James's idea that we cannot adequately describe the experience. But even if these experiences are difficult to describe to others, that generally hasn't stopped people from trying. Prophets, poets, and all sorts of religious practitioners have talked about, written about these types of experiences. For example, or contemporary example, the journalist Michael Pollan, in his book on psychedelics, How to Change Your Mind, describes the loss of ego he experienced on one of his trips. I watched as that familiar self began to fall apart before my eyes, gradually at first and then all at once. I now turned into a sheaf of little papers, no bigger than posters, and they were being scattered to the wind. But the I, taking in this seeming catastrophe, had no desire to chase after the slips and pile my old self back together. No desire to make money. Whoever I now was fine with whatever happened. No more ego. That was okay. In fact, it seemed the most natural thing in the world. But who was this I that was able to take innocence of its own dissolution? Good question. It wasn't me exactly. Here the limits of our language become a problem. In order to completely make sense of the divide that had opened up in my experience, I would need a whole new first-person pronoun. For what was observing the scene was a vantage and mode of awareness entirely distinct from the accustomed self. In fact, I hesitate to use the I to denote presiding awareness. It was so different from my usual first person. The sovereign ego with all its arguments and fears, its backward-looking resentments and forward-looking worries, was simply no one. And there was no one left born its past. Yet something had succeeded it, this bare, disembodied awareness, which gazed upon the sense of the scene of the self's dissolution with benign indifference. I was present to reality, but as something other than myself. And although there was no self left to feel exactly, there was a feeling of knowing, which was calm, and unburdened, content. There was life after the death of the ego. This was big news. Pause. is not a religious person takes this loss of the ego as the defining characteristic of things spiritual. That spiritual experiences are precisely those that arise when the voice of the ego is muted or silenced. And this, he takes as a good thing, because the ego so often gets in our way with its negative self-talk and its limited perspective on the world, what he calls a measly trickle of consciousness. Spirituality is what opens us up to see and feel and experience more than what our ego limits us to. And the neuroscience seems to back that up. MRI studies have demonstrated that when a spiritual experience is being had, the brain's default mode network, which is the source of our ego and sense of self, is quiet. Leading Holland to conclude that the mystical experience may just be what it feels like when you deactivate the brain's default mode network. The psychologist Mark Leary reports more of what neuroscience has taught us about religious experiences. Researchers in the new field of neurotheology have begun to study the changes in the brain that accompany mystical and other kinds of religious experiences. Their findings suggest that mystical states are associated with the disengagement of neural circuits in the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain that generate self-awareness and mark the passage of time. In addition, electrical activity changes in portions of the parietal lobes that orient people spatially and allow them to demarcate the boundary between themselves and the external world. Because the brain can no longer tell where the person ends and the world begins, the individual feels him or herself to be endlessly interconnected with all things. There's also evidence that hyperstimulation, which is produced by prolonged dancing or chanting, affects the parts of the brain that allow people to distinguish themselves from the world. Together, these data suggest that in order for people to have a mystical experience, the regions of the brain that mark the distinction between the self and the world must be quite simple. The fact that mystical states often involve positive emotional experiences also implicates brain regions that control emotion, such as the amygdala. So the way of science then affirms what religions have long taught, that the ego gets in the way of us achieving enlightenment and experiencing the fullness of God. Western religions have traditionally focused on how we can control and change the self, while Eastern religions have focused more on quieting or even losing the self. A great example of the latter is Zen Buddhism, where the goal is to go through every moment of life, no matter what you are doing, with a full and complete attention and no self-harm in your action. Mark Leary, in his book, The Person Itself, explores the ways that our egos hold us back and limit us. And so religions have devised ways to control, overcome, and deny the self. Regarding mystics, he writes that they aim to obtain direct knowledge or first-hand experience of reality without the use of thoughts or reason. And they do that by turning off self-reflection. When they do, they experience the world that is somewhat different from the one they experience in their ordinary states of consciousness. And what do mystics report? That they experience the universe as a unified whole, often that they feel merged with God. Time becomes irrelevant, as if one has escaped from it. They are usually flooded with positive emotions, reporting and feeling peace and love and joy. So the payoff to these spiritual experiences, these moments of awe, is the loss of personal identity, the ego, the sense of self, and what Mark Leary describes as the non-egoic person. For the non-egoic person, the normally boisterous self becomes relatively quiet, the babble replaced by an inner stillness. Because the self is subsiding somewhat, the person feels and appears generally calm, attentive, and content. Without interference by the self, the person stays focused self might offer from time to time. Distinguishing clearly between what is real and what is self-taught